I am reminded of the deeply touching letters, cards, and messages which so many of you have sent my wife.
The grandest palace in the world was never built merely from stone and mortar. It was built from trust bloodlines, and the sacred promise that those who wore the crown would protect those destined to inherit it. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, when the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace cast long amber shadows across centuries-old portraits, the most devastating betrayal in modern royal history began to unravel. Not with a gunshot, not with a public scandal, but with the quiet click of a door closing behind a woman who had finally gone too far. King Charles had spent the better part of 6 months quietly preparing for what royal insiders would later describe as the most emotional transition since the abdication crisis. His health, though never publicly declared fragile, had become a matter of deep private concern among his closest advisers. He had begun the careful, methodical process of transferring the instruments of sovereign authority to Prince William, not in any dramatic ceremony, but in the slow, dignified way that old men pass wisdom to younger ones. A document signed here, a briefing attended there, a ring placed into an outstretched palm. Camilla watched all of it with the patience of a woman who had spent decades learning that power in this institution was never seized. It was maneuvered toward. She had waded through public scorn, tabloid cruelty, and the long cold shadow of Diana's memory. She had finally reached the summit. She was queen consort. Her portrait hung in royal residences. Thousands bowed before her. She had endured the unendurable to get there, and she was not, under any circumstances, prepared to surrender that position to the son of the woman the world still loved more than it would ever love her. What began as quiet resentment slowly calcified into something far darker. Camilla had never truly accepted William. In her private moments, surrounded only by her most trusted confidants, she had made no secret of the fact that she viewed him as an obstacle dressed in the clothing of a dutiful son. He was polite to her face and cold behind her back. He tolerated her the way one tolerates a persistent draft, with resignation, never warmth. And Kate was worse. Kate, with her effortless grace and genuine affection from the public, represented everything Camilla had never been able to fully claim: natural legitimacy. When Charles placed the signet ring, the heavy gold-cast symbol of dynastic authority, into William's palm during a private meeting in the royal study, Camilla felt something inside her snap. She had been passing the corridor. The door had been cracked open just wide enough. She saw the gesture. She understood its permanence. In that single, silent transfer of cold metal from father to son, her future had been quietly foreclosed. She retreated to her private quarters and sat alone for nearly an hour. No tears came. What came instead was calculation. The first phase of her plan was subtle enough to seem like nothing more than royal gossip management. Camilla reached out to a pair of freelance journalists she had used before, two figures known in certain circles for their willingness to manufacture narrative rather than simply report it. She arranged a meeting in the car park of a private members club in Mayfair, arriving wrapped in a coat and scarf that obscured her features entirely. She handed over a substantial amount of cash, withdrawn quietly over several weeks from a personal discretionary account that bypassed the standard royal financial oversight channels. Her instructions were precise. She did not want photographs of William doing anything criminal. She wanted photographs that could be used to build a story about instability, catch him looking tired at a public engagement and frame it as distress, photograph him from unflattering angles during a speech and caption it as confusion. Create the visual language of a man unraveling. Plant the seed. Let the public imagination do the rest. She also gave them a second assignment. She wanted them embedded along William's upcoming tour schedule, close enough to provoke, not physically, but verbally. Whispered cruelties near his ear during public appearances. Questions shouted across crowds designed to rattle rather than inquire. The goal was to manufacture a reaction, something the cameras could catch and the tabloids could twist. What Camilla had severely underestimated was the professionalism and vigilance of William's security detail. They had been briefed not about Camilla specifically, but about the general threat environment around the prince during this particularly sensitive transition period. When one of the journalists maneuvered himself through the outer barricades at a community event in Wales and began shouting provocative questions designed to destabilize the prince, a senior protection officer neutralized the situation in under 15 seconds. The journalist's recording equipment was confiscated and destroyed. He was removed without ceremony or press coverage. When Camilla received the news of this failure, she did not panic. She recalibrated. What she needed was not an external attack. She needed something that came from within, something that would appear to be a collapse rather than an assault, something that could not be blamed on paparazzi or tabloids, something medical. The royal physician had served the palace for over 20 years. He was a quiet, careful man publicly, the sort of professional who spoke in measured tones and chose words with the deliberateness of someone who understood that careless language in his position could cause lasting damage. Privately, he had long nursed debts that his royal salary, generous as it was, had never quite managed to cover. Property investments gone wrong. A son's legal troubles quietly resolved with money he could not truly afford. These were not things he advertised, but they were things Camilla had made it her business to know. She met with him in her private sitting room, having ensured the room was swept for recording devices beforehand and all staff dismissed for the afternoon. She laid out her proposal with the directness of someone who understood that prolonged negotiation only invited hesitation and doubt. She required a simple substitution. William's standard vitamin regimen, which the physician had himself prescribed and which was prepared daily by palace pharmacy staff, needed to be quietly replaced with a compound that would produce symptoms consistent with acute neurological distress, disorientation, trembling, momentary lapses in speech coherence. Nothing life-threatening, nothing permanent, simply the appearance, sustained over several days, of a man whose mind was failing him in real time. In parallel, she required the physician to prepare a falsified psychiatric assessment, a document bearing the official seal of the Royal Medical Team, concluding that the Prince of Wales was exhibiting clinical signs of a severe psychological breakdown and was no longer fit to carry out his public duties. This document would not be submitted through official channels. It would be quietly circulated to select media editors who could be trusted to treat it as a verified leak from inside the palace. She offered him wealth significant enough to dissolve every problem he had quietly carried for years. She offered security for his career, and she made clear, without melodrama, that refusal was not a path that led anywhere comfortable. The physician agreed. His hands trembled slightly as he left the room. Camilla watched him go and felt, for the first time in weeks, something resembling calm. The substituted capsules were introduced into William's supply during a routine pharmacy resupply that passed through the physician's hands. They were identical in appearance to his standard supplements. Same casing, same color, same weight. William had no reason to examine them. He had been taking the same regimen for years. The effects began manifesting within 48 hours during a live broadcast event. Watching from a palace television room, Camilla observed William visibly falter at a public podium, gripping the edges for support, his words losing their usual crisp authority. Cold sweat visible on his forehead under the studio lighting. The physician was positioned nearby and immediately escorted the prince off the stage under the guise of medical concern. He ensured the narrative was framed immediately. The prince had suffered a public health episode. The assessment documents would follow within hours. By that evening, several major tabloid editors had received the falsified psychiatric report. By the following morning, the coverage was everywhere. Crisis behind palace walls. Exclusive William's breakdown. Doctors fear for heir's mental state. Camilla attended a charity function that evening and offered a performance of distressed concern so polished it might have won awards in another lifetime. She spoke of the family's pain. She allowed a single tear to fall at precisely the right moment. She suggested, with aching reluctance, that isolation and specialist treatment might be necessary for William's own protection. She believed she was 2 days away from having him removed. She had not accounted for Kate. Princess Kate had always possessed a quality that those who underestimated her consistently failed to identify until it was too late. She was not merely composed under pressure. She was sharpest under it. The moment William was escorted from the public event, something in her went very quiet and very focused. She did not cry. She did not seek comfort. She looked at her husband's face and saw not a man having a breakdown. She saw a man who had been chemically ambushed. She returned to the private suite where William was resting and moving with the methodical focus of someone running through a mental checklist. She examined everything on his breakfast tray that hadn't been cleared. When she found the vitamin bottle, she didn't open it casually. She carried it to the bathroom, locked the door, and systematically broke open several of the capsules over the sink. The powder inside was wrong. Wrong texture, wrong scent, wrong color at the edges where the casing had split. She wrapped the remaining capsules in a handkerchief, placed them in the interior pocket of her coat, and walked back into the room where William sat with his head in his hands. She told him quietly what she had found. She told him that she did not believe he was unwell. She told him that she believed someone inside the palace had poisoned him deliberately, and that they could not trust the royal medical staff. She told him what they were going to do next. William looked at his wife for a long moment. The chemical fog was still pressing against the inside of his skull, but somewhere beneath it, something clarified. He stood up. He put on his coat. He walked out of the suite without requesting assistance from any palace staff. Kate had already made a phone call to a private analytical laboratory, fully independent, internationally accredited, operating entirely outside the NHS and Royal Institutional framework. Within 3 hours of their arrival, comprehensive blood and substance analysis had been completed. The results confirmed the presence of a powerful sedative compound administered at doses far exceeding any therapeutic threshold. The neurological assessment conducted independently confirmed that William's cognition was entirely intact beneath the chemical interference. William walked out of that facility with the documentation in hand. He said nothing to the press. He simply held the document up. The cameras did the rest. By that evening, the breakdown narrative had collapsed entirely. But exposing the symptoms was not the same as exposing the architect. William and his small, trusted circle understood that without identifying the source of the substituted medication and proving the chain of instruction, Camilla could simply allow others to absorb the consequence, while she maintained plausible distance. It was Edward, William's longest-serving private advisor, a man of unremarkable appearance and extraordinary methodical intelligence, who located the physical evidence. Gaining access to the royal physician's private office during the doctor's absence, Edward conducted a systematic search that required no technological sophistication, only patience and the knowledge that guilty men rarely use complex hiding places. They use convincing ones. Behind a loosened floor tile, beneath the physician's desk, Edward found a sealed compartment. Inside it was the physician's private record-keeping journal, the real one, not the falsified version submitted to media contacts. And tucked between the pages was something Edward had not anticipated finding: a photograph. A Polaroid, hastily taken, but perfectly clear, showing the physician cradling an elaborate diamond and sapphire necklace. A piece Edward recognized immediately from royal collection records, and from the memory of having seen it displayed prominently at a formal palace dinner the previous year. The necklace had belonged to Camilla. The evidence of the bribe was tangible, physical, and undeniable. But it was still circumstantial, without testimony. What they needed was Camilla's own words. What none of them knew, and what Camilla herself did not know, was that the words had already been captured. Andrew, Camilla's former husband, had moved quietly through the margins of royal life for years following their divorce. He was not a bitter man, publicly. He had rebuilt his life with a degree of dignity that those who had expected his permanent destruction had not anticipated. But he had never stopped being aware of who Camilla was beneath the cultivated public image. He had lived with her. He had seen, in their private years together, the mechanics of how she approached people and situations she viewed as obstacles. He had recognized the pattern of what she was doing to William the moment the tabloid stories began appearing. Andrew had not approached William or Kate. He had not gone to the press. He had gone quietly to St. George's Chapel on the night he calculated Camilla would be there to conclude her financial arrangements with the physician and the journalists she had employed. He had known she would choose that location. It was the kind of choice that reflected how she thought about herself. Dramatic settings for significant moments. He had arrived an hour before her. He had positioned himself behind a stone column near the side altar where the chapel's shadow was absolute. He had waited. He had recorded everything. Every word she spoke, every envelope of cash she surrendered, every cold-blooded sentence of her confession delivered in the language of someone who had never once considered that accountability might reach her. When she turned to leave, he stepped out. Their exchange was brief. Andrew did not threaten her. He did not demand anything. He told her simply that it was finished, turned, and walked away through the chapel's side entrance. He drove directly to William's residence. It was past midnight. William and Kate were still awake. Andrew placed the USB drive containing the complete video recording on the table in front of them and said only that he had stayed silent for too long, and that silence had a cost he was no longer willing to pay. The formal dinner Camilla had orchestrated for the following evening was intended to be her decisive moment, the occasion on which she would present King Charles with what she framed as the painful but necessary recommendation that William be placed in institutional care for his own protection and the stability of the monarchy. She had prepared her language carefully. She had rehearsed the precise ratio of sorrow to practicality. She was ready to watch the king, gutted by parental anguish, make the decision she had spent weeks engineering. The dining room was candlelit and formal. Charles sat at the head of the long table, his face etched with the complex tiredness of a father who has been told his son is unwell and doesn't yet know whether to believe it. Camilla was to his right in her black velvet dress, multi-strand pearl necklace resting with deliberate visual authority at her collar. William and Kate sat opposite, composed and absolutely still. Camilla opened proceedings before the second course had been cleared. She spoke of duty, of difficult truths, of the medical assessment and the palace physician's professional conclusions. She spoke of isolation facilities in Scotland that could provide William with the dignity of private recovery. She spoke of the weight Charles carried and the further weight that an unstable heir would add to it. William did not interrupt her. He waited. When she finished speaking, he stood. He pushed the silver cutlery in front of him aside with a single, controlled sweep of his arm and reached into his coat pocket. He removed the small, transparent bottle containing the substituted capsules and slid it across the mahogany surface of the table until it came to rest directly in front of Camilla. He named the compound inside it. He described its effects. He described the timeline of its administration relative to his public episode. He watched Camilla's face with the calm attention of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the formality to conclude. When she attempted to reframe what he had presented as delusion, the instinctive last defense of a person whose position is crumbling, Kate nodded to Edward, who had been waiting in the corridor. The doors opened. The physician was brought in, escorted by two senior members of the household guard. He was in a state of visible psychological disintegration. He did not require coercion. He confessed immediately, completely, and in specific detail, looking at the floor rather than at any of the faces in the room. Charles picked up the Polaroid photograph Edward had placed before him. He looked at it for a long time. He recognized the necklace. He recognized the physician. He set the photograph down and sat very still. Camilla attempted one final pivot, accusing Kate of having orchestrated the physician's testimony, claiming the evidence had been fabricated as part of a conspiracy against her. She was still speaking when Andrew walked into the room. He did not announce himself. He walked directly to the large display screen mounted on the far wall, the one typically used for family occasion presentations, and plugged the USB drive into its input port. He turned to look at Camilla once. He pressed play. The chapel appeared on the screen. The candles, the stone altar, the envelopes. Camilla's voice, unmistakably hers, filled the dining room with its own clarity. Every word of her confession played back in front of the man she had married, the son she had plotted against, the woman who had dismantled her scheme, and the former husband whose silence she had relied upon as a permanent resource. When the screen went dark, the wine glass in Camilla's hand was no longer in it. It had fallen. The wine spread across the carpet in a slow, dark bloom. King Charles did not shout. He did not weep. He stood slowly, the way old men stand when the cost of rising is worth paying for what must be said. He looked at Camilla with the expression of a man who is finally seeing something that had always been there, partially obscured, and is now seen in full and cannot be unseen. He told her that she had tried to destroy his son. He told her that she had corrupted a man he had trusted with his family's health. He told her that she had lied to him with the fluency of someone who had been lying to him for a very long time. He told her that he was dissolving their marriage, not through a private announcement or a carefully drafted communication to senior courtiers. He said it aloud, in that room, in front of witnesses, with the directness of a man who understood that certain conclusions did not benefit from diplomatic softening. The pearl necklace, the formal symbol of her status as queen consort, was removed. Not gently. The thread gave way under the force of the separation, and the pearls scattered across the marble floor with the hollow, rapid percussion of something precious being broken open. Her cipher, the engraved badge denoting her position in the household, was unpinned from her dress by two guards who moved with the expressionless efficiency of people performing a task they had been briefed on in advance. She was escorted from the dining room. She passed through the corridor where, pressed against the walls in absolute silence, stood the full gathering of domestic staff, household attendants, and security personnel. Not one of them looked away. Not one of them bowed. There was no royal vehicle waiting outside. There was an armored transport of the kind used for individuals whose movements require absolute security and zero public contact. She was placed inside it. The doors closed. It moved into the London darkness and was gone. The destination was a remote property in mid-Wales, secure, isolated, fully supervised, stripped of every modern connectivity that would have allowed her to continue exercising